Hey, what's up everyone? It's Jared from One Earth Mushrooms. So a little bit ago I did that Lacto Ferment project with corn, and I wanted to try it again, but using rye grain this time. So if you haven't seen on my Facebook or Instagram, the Lacto Ferment with corn actually turned out a lot better than in the video that I published. So here is the jar that I inoculated, and as you can see, it's almost fully colonized. There's still at the bottom some areas I haven't colonized yet, but it's getting there. The only thing about this is I had to use... There's a plane flying over. Let's let it fly over before we keep going. So the only thing about this one that I don't like is I had to use grain spawn from a source that used a pressure cooker. So what I'm trying to do is basically find a way to eliminate using a pressure cooker. So for this experiment, I'm going to do three things. One, I'm going to do 2 jars of lacto fermented rye grain. One, I'm going to stop at 10 days and inoculate. The other one, I'll stop at 14 days and inoculate. Second, I'm going to take these 2 jars and I'll prepare them just like I would if I was going to sterilize in the pressure cooker, except for I'm going to skip that step and replace the pressure cooker with just boiling on the stove. So I'll soak the grain, I will boil it in a pot, I'll dry it out, I'll add it to the jars, and then close the jars, put the jars in boiling water on the stove for an amount of time, which I haven't determined yet, and then we'll inoculate that way. And then as a control, I'm going to do 2 jars just like normal. So these jars will go through the full process of soaking, boiling, pressure cooking, and then inoculating. And we'll see the difference between all 3. Honestly, I'm anticipating these will get contaminated, but if they don't, that would be awesome. It would just be a really cool way to figure out if we can or can't prepare grain without using a pressure cooker. Pressure cookers are getting hard to find and they're kind of expensive. So if we can figure out a way to get grain going without a pressure cooker, I think that would be a huge bonus for a lot of people out there. Alright, so let's jump right into it.
I started by drilling 2 holes in each of the jar lids. One hole is for an injection port and the other hole is for a breathe port. Then flip each lid over to deburr the bottom side, and I'm using a step drill bit here, which I find to be the most effective way to drill holes in lids for grain spawn. I then measured out 150 grams of dried rye grain for each of my 6 jars. I took the jars over to the sink and gave each one of the jars a single rinse. Then I got my tap water as hot as I could get it and filled each jar to soak overnight. Using hot water helps germinate any spores or bacteria that are already in the grain spawn, and that helps it die off easier when we boil it later. I let the jars soak overnight for about 12 hours. And here we are the next day. You can see that there's already a lot of activity from any germinated spores or bacteria that are in there, producing gases and causing some stirring action of the grain bed. I dumped all the jars into my pot and heated them up to a boil, then reduced the heat to keep it just at a low simmer, and I boiled them for about 10 minutes. This will effectively kill off most of the spores and bacteria that's already in the grain when it comes from the field, and it also helps our grain absorb as much water as it can. We want our grain to be fully soaked through, and the only way to do that is through boiling. After the boil, I strained the water off through a colander. For the 2 jars that I'm lacto fermenting, I put 200 grams of the soaked and boiled rye grain into the jars, and then filled the jars with tap water. I'm going almost all the way to the top here, just right up to the rim. For the rest of the grain, that's going to be going into the boil-only jars and the 2 control jars. I poured it out onto baking sheets and I let it dry for about an hour. Halfway through I mixed it just to get all of the grain dry. And what we're looking for is at the end the surface of the grain to be dry. After the grain was dry, I tried to evenly distribute it through the remaining 4 jars, but it turns out that I had way more grain than I needed. So I ended up taking some of the extra grain and putting it into a couple other jars and using that for a lion's mane project that I got going on. Just want to give you all a quick view of how I install the plugs into the top of the lids. It's not super hard to do, but it does take a little bit of technique. So you kind of have to wiggle it in and squeeze the bottom part that penetrates through the lid. And then I give it a little twist on the way in, and that actually helps it seat pretty well. I'm covering each of the vent ports with micropore tape. This is a product that comes from 3M, and it's what I use as the vent on all of my grain jars. For the 2 boil-only jars, I cover them with tin foil, and this is actually one thing that I'm not really convinced is required either, but kind of out of habit, it's something that I still do. I think in the future I'm just going to skip this step. So I put a trivet in the bottom of my pot on the stove at home, threw the jars in, got the water up to a boil, and then covered the pot with a lid. And actually had a little bit of difficulty finding the right lid, so I threw this big fat lid on first and then eventually found the correct lid for the pot. So we can still see what's going on inside the pot while it boils. I'll let the jars boil for 30 minutes. Conveniently, this helped me get my breakfast done at the same time. Alright, so jars 3 and 4 are ready to go. I've just gotta let them cool down and then later we can inoculate them. For jars 5 and 6, I'm gonna pressure cook these at 15 psi for 90 minutes. And this is the standard procedure that I use for any time I make grain spawn in the traditional fashion. Once the pressure cooker got up to 15 psi, I turned my heat source down a little bit so that it didn't vigorously boil, but maintained 15 psi. Alright, so now this is the next day, and I've let all 4 of these jars cool down. I have a syringe here of liquid culture, and this is king oyster. I think elsewhere in this video I might have called it blue oyster, but this is a king oyster liquid culture, which is just mycelium that's suspended in a syringe full of water. I start out by shooting a little bit of rubbing alcohol onto the injection ports here, and then I heat the needle up until it glows red, shoot a little bit of the liquid culture out to cool the needle, and then I injected about 3 cc's into each of these jars. Moving over to the Lacto Ferment jars, this here is jar number 1, and it's fermented for 10 days at this point. And you can see there's no injection port installed, there's no tape put over the hole for the vent. I'm trying to just leave it open so that any bacteria and fungi, spores, or anything that's in the atmosphere can get through those holes and help establish that lacto ferment environment that we're looking to get here. You see the grain looks pretty soupy right now. It's pretty sticky on the outside of the grain, and I think that's just a result of the grain skin breaking down under the lacto fermentation. I rinsed the grain off with some cold water, and then I let it sit for about an hour to drip dry, and then moved it over to a drying pan, and I put a shirt down to help absorb some of the liquid. In the last project, I had a lot of problems with too wet of grain, so in this experiment, I'm going to try to dry it out a little bit more. Eventually, I put it under a fan to help dry it even faster. So after about 2 hours of air drying, the grain looks nice and ready to go for inoculation. So I'm going to be using a culture here from a pink oyster grow that I did a while back. And this is pink oyster that's been on agar for a few months. I'm cutting the agar inside my still air box because I don't want to contaminate my agar here. But as you can see, I'm not taking all the precautions. I didn't bother putting gloves on, and I didn't even spray anything down on the inside. I ran out of rubbing alcohol and I've been too lazy to go to the store and get more. So I'm taking, we'll call it very moderate precautions here to not contaminate my pink oyster. And then in open air, I'm just scraping those 2 little chunks of agar into jar number 1 for the Lacto Ferment. And I decided not to film this part of it, but I did the exact same procedure with jar number 2, except for that one was fermented for 14 days instead of 10 days. I'll talk about results of that in just a second here.
Hey, what's up everyone? So today is day 21 of this experiment. Just a reminder of what we got going on here. So these 2 jars are both lacto fermented. The first jar I fermented for 10 days. Jar 2 I fermented for 14 days. And then jars 3 and 4, I prepared the grain like I normally would, except for I didn't pressure cook. And instead of pressure cooking, I put the grain into a pot on the stove and boiled it for 30 minutes. And then these 2, they didn't colonize at all, which is kind of weird, but I prepared these just like normal. These were supposed to be my control samples. I don't know why that happened, but yeah, sometimes that just happens. So I want to talk a little bit about the results. With jar 1, it looked pretty good. The grain was looking great when it dried, and then when I put it back in the jar, I threw the agar in, and it was looking pretty bang up. But as you can see, it got colonized pretty rapidly with green mold, and then yellow mold and black mold is in there too. A little bit of the hyphae from the oyster started taking off, but it got quickly taken over by the competing molds. So jar number 2 it actually started colonizing pretty well with the pink oyster, but again, this one also got taken over by green mold. So I think all that green mold is coming in from the drying process. In the past, like when I did the first experiment with lacto fermentation, I used corn, but I didn't dry it very well, and it ended up being really wet in the bottom of the jar. And you can see that here, how the jar got like a good, ½ inch of liquid at the bottom, which just caused it to ferment more. It wasn't able to colonize in the bottom, so that one came out pretty rough. So I tried to dry the grain more, which ended up resulting in spending a lot of time just in open air without all the low pH liquid around it, and it allowed quite a bit of other bacteria to get into it. So I might need to figure out a better process for drying. Honestly, if I threw it in the oven or something for a little bit to dry it, I think that might work better. But yeah, we'll see. I don't have any solid ideas on how I want to proceed with experiment number 3 quite yet. Okay, moving on to jars 3 and 4. They looked good. Jar 3, right now, oops. You can see jar 3 is it appears to be fully colonized, but you can see the grains are looking a little bit weird. And I will break this up and show you guys what I suspect is going on here. So I'm pretty sure this has got some wet rot going on inside of it, and we'll take a look at that to see if the same thing in jar 3 is what happened in jar 4. So jar 4 looked the same. I shook this 3 days ago, and you can see it did not bounce back like it normally does. And the grain just looks disgusting. It got all sloppy all over the side of the jar. It's not colonizing the way that it normally does. It just looks really wet and disgusting.
So I think that these two jars, which just, again, these jars were boiled instead of pressure cooked. So I boiled the jars for 30 minutes instead of pressure cooked them. These two jars, I'm pretty sure, are full of wet rot. But I'm gonna do one last ditch effort on jar 3 here. I'll give it a shake, see how the grain looks, and if it's looking clean, then I might actually have some success with that. But yeah, we'll look at that in a second. And then jars 5 and 6, the grain still looks clean. There's no contamination or anything in there. Obviously no hyphae growing from the blue oyster either though. So I'm probably just gonna take, I have pink oyster going on some other jars, also lion's mane on some other jars. So I'm just gonna do a grain to grain to save this grain instead of wasting it, because I still think it's a viable grain. I mean, nothing's contaminated there, so I don't want to lose all that grain, so I'll just move that on to a different experiment. Okay, so it actually looks like I was wrong about jar number 3. After the shake, I'm looking at the grains, and it looks like you would expect grain to look after a shake. When I shook jar number 4 earlier, this was a couple days ago when I shook this one, it was just like a big soupy mess. But this, the moisture content is looking fine. The growth of the hyphae, the mycelium, was looking beautiful all the way throughout. It was nice and white all the way on the inside. So I'm gonna leave this jar I'm gonna let it recolonize, like let the hyphae come back to its full strength. And I'm actually gonna, I think I'm changing my thoughts here on what I'm gonna do. So I had intended on colonizing these two with either the pink oyster that I have in a jar or lion's mane, but I think I'm just gonna do a grain to grain from this blue oyster, which looks like it's turning out pretty okay, onto these two. And then kind of also is sending me in the direction of something I want to try. I want to try this one again, try this experiment again, and do a larger study size this time. So instead of just the 2 jars boiled, I'll probably do 4 and kind of just see what the failure rate or the success rate on that is. So that will come out at some point. You guys know me, sometimes I got a million experiments going and it takes me a while to get results out, but I will give that a shot. As far as the Lacto Ferment, I'm not sure where I'm going with that yet, but when I figure it out, I'll let you know. Right on. Hey, thanks for watching, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed this experiment. I know it wasn't super fruitful. I wasn't able to pull off the Lacto Ferment for the attempt number 2, but like I've said before, I'm not going to quit experimenting just because it failed. We'll learn something from each failure and we'll move on, make it better, and eventually I'm sure we'll have success. And if not, I'm not afraid to admit defeat at some point. So, alright, yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you around next time. Thanks, bye.